I'm Doug Monroe. I'm the North American Merchandising Manager for Boortmalt. So what we're going to try to do here is go through each of the specifications and relate it back to agronomic practices that will help you avoid some of issues that may lead to you not having your barley selected. So we'll start with, we talked about protein. So target 11 and a half to 12. Usually in, some maltsters will go up higher for different types of malt. So just higher protein, there's more enzymes, it malts faster. This may be more, this malt in North America is usually destined for distillers or high adjunct brewers in North America. Excess protein, though, can cause haze in beer. So if you've poured it into a glass and there's a haze or white little floaties in there, that usually means that this beer was made with high protein. So the protein coagulates again. And so in the brew house, it's harder to filter. Usually takes longer to process. So it costs the brewers time and money to filter the barley. Okay, next one is, and I did talk about germination as being the most important spec. So if it doesn't grow, we can't malt it. So 9.5. I wish it was 9.5. 95% germination, and that's on like a 4 mil. We also do 8 mils for water sensitivity, just to make sure if the barley is really water sensitive, it still grows, but we have to process it slightly different because it'll absorb water way quicker. So what's wrong with low germ? Well, there's poor starch modification. There's not the enzyme activity that the brewer needs. Generally low extract because the starch has not been modified. Low friability, meaning the brewer it's a hard time to mill it. And of course, you'll get cloudiness in the wort. One of the things get a lot of questions about with pre-harvest sprouting. So there's a few methods of measuring pre-harvest sprouting. There's the chit method where you pearl the barley and see if the embryo knocks off. That's quick. We do that. Probably the more scientific way of doing it and probably more reliable is the RVA measurement. So that's measures the starch integrity of the barley. So generally, if you suspect you have a chit problem or a pre-harvest sprout problem, it's nice to get an RVA done. It'll give you a better idea of what kind of risk you have for loss of germination. So at harvest, your barley might be 95 germ, but if you have a low RVA, it's not going to store well and it'll lose germination quickly. Two things about RVA to remember is that there's the actual RVA number and then also the moisture attached to your barley. So even you could have a fairly, let's say, a mid-range RVA number, but if your moisture is really high, you could still lose your germination quickly. So keep that in mind. And now we'll get Andrew to talk about things you can do to save germination.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Hector, and I'm the Agronomy Extension Specialist for cereal crops with Manitoba Crop Alliance. Doug said germination is such an important factor for malt, and there are a few things that you can do as producers that help reduce risk of this, losing germination. One of the big ones to discuss is pre-harvest sprouting. So pre-harvest sprouting or chitting is a big issue in malting barleys and Canadian malting barleys because they're almost bred to have the absence of dormancy, like they're made to sprout quickly. So pre-harvest sprouting, though, is when barley starts to germinate or the germination process starts in the head, actually. So either it's still in the grains in the head standing or it's in the swath if you swathed it. So prolonged periods of wet weather, even heavy dews, rain, ill-timed rains are what cause pre-harvest sprouting. um, in barleys. So, like Doug was mentioning, pre-harvest sprouting really can affect the long-term storability of these grains. But there are a few things that can be done. One is thinking about your harvest practices. So, swathing versus straight cutting. Swathing typically is seen as a practice that has a higher risk for pre-harvest sprouting if you get the ill-timed rains. So if you're in areas that have you typically get rains in the fall or even really early snows and these heavy dews, that's something to consider when you're swathing. If you're straight cutting, typically the aim is for moisture is 13.5% grain moisture to harvest, but that's not always the case, and with that there can be issues with pre-harvest sprouting because the grain is standing for longer to dry out. So you can harvest early to preserve malt quality. That means harvesting even at 16 to 18% grain moisture if you have access to drying equipment and you're willing to dry. So that's hot air or high temperature heating is that I'm talking about with 16 to 18% grain moisture. One thing to note about drying though is that if you dry it at too high of a temperature, you can also lose germination that way. So the motto is dry low and slow. For the general recommendation is for the barley kernel not to go above 42 degrees Celsius when you're drying. As well, as we talked about before, stored grain can be an issue over the long term if it's not stored properly for germ loss. So store grain in a cool, dry, aerated bins and turn regularly to preserve that germination. So cooling the grain also reduces the environment where fungi can grow. So you're really trying to cool that grain right away. But then for long-term storage, you want it less than that 10 degrees Celsius. Even if you have okay moisture, if your temperatures are high, you will lose your allowable storage limit will be reduced significantly.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We'll move on to plumpness. So plumpness is measured by sieves, and the real number is we usually buy off the 664. So when you see that plump being 85, that's the sieve that it's coming off of. We do look at the 564s too, because that's usable barley too. So thin kernels usually get cleaned out. It's a loss for us. Even in the malt house, it's uneven modification. Of course, they're not plump. They don't have the starch that the brewer needs. No extract. So usually this is what happens in drought years. You get a plumpness that's it is lower. Smaller kernels do hydrate faster, so it makes it harder to malt if you have a mixture of different plump grains. So we'll move to Jeremy for plump management.
Good morning, everyone. Jeremy Boychyn, Director of Research, Agronomy, and Extension at Alberta Grains. Obviously, environment, as Doug mentioned, is going to play a huge role in what your plumps look like, specifically during that grain fill period. If we're lacking in moisture in the soil, we're not going to get those grains filling and getting bigger. So that's going to play a huge role in what you're dealing with plumps versus thins. In a year like this, like Peter mentioned on the onset of the presentation, we were relatively dry early in the season. And then, we've seen some moisture through late June and into July now. And what we can see coming from some of that is the potential for late tillers. That plant was stressed early on, and then we get some rain and it decides, hey, there's enough resources here for me to put out some late tillers. And those late tillers can actually be a strong source for thins later in the season because they end up not being as mature. when we look to harvest the main heads or the main yield-bearing parts of the plants, you're essentially looking at potentially two different stages of crop that you're harvesting. So those considerations are important to think about as you're going into harvest and what you might be looking for. So that being said, if you are doing something like swathing, one of the things to be considerate of is to not swath too early. So you really want to be targeting that 30% moisture or below for swathing, in that 30 to 25% range, because if you end up swathing too early, that grain is still filling, and it's still getting enlarged. So if you're swathing too early, you end up cutting off the translocation of energy from the plant to the grain, reducing the size of the grain. So you want to make sure that you're at that 30% or 25% before you start getting in the field with the swather. And if you are in that situation where you're dealing with some late tillers, that's a situation where um, you can think, okay, what part of this crop am I swathing or harvesting for? Because some of those late tillers you may want to treat a little bit differently, and maybe harvest or swath a little bit on the earlier side if it's not a large yield bearing part of your crop, if it's just a small amount of tillers. And in that situation, you may actually want to see those swathed a little bit earlier. And then potentially, depending on the situation you're sitting in, is blow those out the back if there's a minimal amount of those, and reduce the risk of that impacting your acceptance. So if that's something that you don't have a lot of experience with, I highly suggest reaching out to an experienced agronomist to assess the crop before going into it. Um, and then monitoring those fan settings to make sure that you're not either blowing out too much or not removing those that you want to remove if you're dealing with those thin kernels. So it's gonna be important to monitor the samples on the monitor, or on the combine as you're moving forward. So it's gonna really take, what am I looking at in terms of crop, in terms of staging, and then making the assessment of where do I want my risk to be, and how am I managing my timing, and my combine settings to minimize the amount of risk for thin kernels.
Okay, so we mentioned peeled and broken. So the economic of this is, well, peeled and broken get cleaned out. It's a loss. In the malt house, the peeled kernels, when they germinate in the process, you can easily knock off the embryo when it's not protected by the hull with barley. So that is then germination stops. The endosperm doesn't get modified, and also, as we mentioned before, the broken kernel. So half of it has the embryo, the other half doesn't, and it doesn't malt properly. And many of you know that we also malt wheat. This is a serious problem with wheat because it doesn't have that hull, so it's very difficult. We try to baby the wheat through there with turns and that with our augers and that to make sure we do not damage that embryo off the kernel. So Mitch will talk about some things to negate P and B.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mitchell Japp, the Research and Extension Manager with SaskBarley. So I think when talking about peeled and broken, a couple things that come out to me are limiting the number of passes through the combine, through augers, is ideal, because you're dealing with low moisture grain, and that's where your risk of peeled and broken increases. And so if you're harvesting in hot, dry conditions, so that grain is already dried, probably below that 13.5%, if you haven't been able to get into the field to get it out before, targeting that 13.5%, or if it's exceptionally hot, it can lead to peeled and broken. And so minimizing the number of passes through the combine, so trying to get everything that you want in the tank first pass through, not running it through the return auger. And if you have to move it around. So, you know, Andrew talked about perhaps moving grain around to keep it cool and dry. And if you've got that in at already super dry conditions, I would say that's the one instance where moving it around might be one you'd want to limit, just because you're trying to minimize the number of times through the through an auger. I think you know, making sure also that you're running the equipment full, so the auger full, the combine full. If you're if you're in an area that has been very dry, you're looking at a thin stand, but still targeting that malt end use. Then if you're not able to run a wide enough straight cut header to keep the combine running full, or run fast enough to run it full, and consider a swath with a double swath to bring it together. Now, I think that's a relatively limited area that we'll have to focus on that for this particular year, but back in 2021, that was more widespread. When harvesting those hot, dry conditions, one thing that can be done is managing when the harvesting is happening to avoid the heat of the day. But if you're able to continue through, it's a good job to pass on to the trucker to get them to be watching as the grain's coming through. If there's any increase in peeled and broken happening, and that's a good signal to get back to the combine operator to get out there and readjust that combine, make sure the rotor speed and concave or the clearance past the rotor are appropriate. I guess the best preventative measure is if you can get out there at a little bit higher moisture content. You know, certainly 16-18% is a reasonable target for harvesting bulk malt barley. At higher moisture contents, you're going to need some grain drying. Lower moisture contents and early enough in the season, you can manage with aeration. So I think if you're looking for more resources on that, that's something that we do have on our YouTube page. There's some videos with some experienced malt growers in 2021 and what they were doing to manage their peeled and broken.
Okay, thanks, Mitchell. So green kernels, immaturity. So we've just briefly again on this, generally immature kernels don't germinate, so there's no modification. Doesn't look good in your malt, which sometimes is important to the brewer. So it lowers your extract. Friability is not very good. So the target is 2% of immature kernels. We'll let Andrew talk about management of green kernels.
Thanks, Doug. So there's no perfect way to manage green kernels, as it will differ by operation needs, their harvest window that they have, equipment that is available. But there are a few considerations to look at. One, if we're talking about this broadly, be end-use market. But our end-use market that we're targeting is Malting. As we know, there's very low specs or tight specs for this. Another consideration, if this grain needs to be stored, is that green kernels usually have more moisture and can be prone to spoilage. So as you're trying to store your grain at 13.5% moisture or less, this can play a role in spoiling your grain or other storage challenges over the long term. So that's just something to be cognizant about. So as Jeremy was mentioning before, it's these green kernels could be due to uneven maturity across a field. This could be due to different times of germination, or there could be a late flush of tillers as well that are further behind the main stem or the main stem, which contributes most to yield. So one step is to go out and scout your field. So go and scout in multiple spots in your field to investigate the extent of green kernels and late tillers and determine their crop staging too. So is it for every main stem tiller, there's one late season tiller with green kernels, or sorry, one main stem to late season tiller, or is it a 2-to-1 ratio? And this can give you an idea of your overall how much those late tillers or green kernels will be contributing to yield. As well, you should be looking at crop staging. How far behind are those green kernels compared to your main stem? So understanding the staging is important because looking at like water ripe compared to soft dough, those moisture levels are quite a bit different. So something you can think about is that on hot days, you can expect grain to dry in the field. So this is 25 degrees Celsius with good conditions, it's sunny. You can expect about 2% grain drying a day. But if it's overcast, cooler, this is closer to 1. So using this information, you can estimate somewhat how long it will take those green kernels to mature, and if it's worth the risk for you, if they're yield bearing, or if they're contributing quite a bit to yield, if it's worth the risk to let your crop sit a little bit longer so that they dry down. But this might not be the case. Remember, you also have to think about shattering for those mature kernels or the mature stems, and yield loss on that side as well, and quality loss. So swathing also can be used at times at even maturity to avoid crop loss of the mature main stems or mature tillers, and helps hasten the maturity of those late tillers to some extent. From here, the grain can be allowed to dry to a safe moisture content. But if you're going to swath again, review like your local forecasts for pre-harvest sprouting risks. If the distribution of green kernels is quite distinct, so if it's in patches, there might be an opportunity to harvest the mature areas first and then come back and harvest the less mature areas and try to balance it that way. And then there's also seed cleaning if the cost makes sense. It's quite expensive, so it has to fit your operation and the economics of that year's crop. So
heated kernels. So generally the spec on that is nil or 0%. What's wrong with heated kernels? They do not germinate, so they cannot be malted. Can contribute to off flavors and dark color in the malt if we've malted it with the heated kernels.
Yeah, so as this slide says, the heated kernels are a result of poor storage conditions, and sometimes can result from variations from the average. And so if you've got situations like Andrew was just talking about with green kernels, where you can end up with something with potentially higher moisture content, and so you end up with pockets in the bin that have higher moisture. That can be a source where that heating can start and spread. And so making sure that you have relatively uniform grain quality going in terms of moisture content and everything being fully mature and dry can make a big difference. And so the tips that Andrew talked about are valid here as well. But that said, I think there's also a lot of tools available now for grain bin monitoring that give a good sense of any changes in moisture content or temperature throughout the bin. And so if the crop is uniform and going in at 13.5% or less moisture content, it should be relatively safe from heated kernels. But if it's lacking uniformity, then that needs to be managed through aeration, and that probably will require at least removing some of the grain out to get assessments of pockets throughout that storage, so that they can be monitored more closely rather than as an overall average, because it's variations from the average that are often the problem with heated kernels. This is a good chart to have for overall storage, targeting safe storage for long periods of time. And so if the temperature can be managed, and so getting any high temperature grain that comes in down and cooled, so with aeration, getting that cooled quickly, or if you're lacking aeration, then cycling the bin, taking grain out and then cooling it off, having that rapid cooling done very, very quickly after it goes into the bin. Makes a big difference in how long it can be stored. The moisture content is also critical. This doesn't actually show the 13.5% target that we're looking for. So just a little bit between the 12 and 14%. But if you get that temperature down to even 15 degrees and the moisture content around 13, you're looking at relatively long storage period. And of course, that can be managed with grain grind too, if it's coming in at high moisture content. And as you can see, if you're coming in at 18% moisture content in any kind of temperature, if it's harvest in August, it's going to be coming in relatively warm. That safe storage time is very, very short. In some cases, less than a week. So you want to get that drying capacity ready to go before the combines roll, so that they can be moving in there. And Andrew talked about the safe temperature for drying and malt barley, keeping that grain temperature less than 42 degrees Celsius. I think the other thing to consider is if you do have high moisture grains, so up to 18%, you're high enough that you're going to have to run through that in batches. So you want a maximum of 4% moisture content drop per pass through the grain dryer.
Okay, staining. Staining usually occurs when it's in the swath or just standing before harvest and it gets wet. There's usually this is higher moisture barley also, and as we say here, it increases microflora on the raw barley, and this causes us a problem in the malt house. Sometimes this barley is hard to get going because of the microflora competing with the oxygen in the water in the steep tanks. And of course, in the final product, we talked about beer gushing before, can cause disruptions in fermentation for the brewers. It is a large problem for distillers for their fermentation process. So Jeremy will discuss how to avoid some staining issues.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So as Doug mentioned, this really comes down to a mature crop experiencing and standing in a high moisture situation, and what we end up getting is non-pathogenic fungi that end up colonizing the mature or dead material on the plant, which ends up being the outside of the barley grain as well. So it really becomes a balancing act of reducing the amount of time that your mature barley is in the field, while ensuring that we're not taking off thin kernels because we're bringing it off too early, and not bringing it off where it's too high moisture, and then you start getting high risk of high moisture grain and storage. And so it also comes down to what type of equipment and logistics that you have on the farm to balance this correctly. So it is really going to be a farm to farm specific management practice. But if you think of it as just minimizing the amount of time that barley grain is in the field under high moisture conditions, you can start to think about how you can properly approach that. So timely harvest. If you're targeting malt, that crop should be a higher priority to make sure that you're getting out there at the appropriate time for swathing or for straight cutting. And really, we do want to be targeting straight cut over swathing if we want to minimize the amount of staining that's going to occur, because as things are sitting in the swath, generally it takes a little bit longer for that to dry out, which allows more colonization to occur on that dead plant material, which increases your risks of staining. So targeting the appropriate time for swathing is going to be important if you're going in that direction, or waiting and timing your harvest appropriately with straight cut, so that your standing crop in the field is experiencing the least amount of moisture as possible. And the other area that you'll start to see risks is if high moisture grain is going into the bin. That will continue to heat and sweat if you don't get aeration on that and dry it down relatively quickly. So you want to take action to reduce moisture at a safe rate, as Andrew mentioned, low and slow, to make sure you're minimizing damage from drying, but getting that to a safe moisture level is going to help minimize the amount of staining that occurs.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Varietal purity. So, as we mentioned with varietal purity, it helps. We buy by variety, and generally, this is for each variety has a slightly different malting properties. So, in the malt house, we might process it differently. We also like the varietal purity because not all brewers accept all our varieties. Like we could get, some, for example, a Japanese brewer who will only take Synergy and Connect. They haven't approved, or for some reason they found something lacking in one of maybe like Fraser. So they so when we make the blend for these brewers, we cannot use one of the varieties, so we cannot have them mixed. Uh, so, and then I guess on the export side, it is a highlight for most Canadian barley, especially into China, of the of us separating by variety. We do sell some barley that is mixed for malting, but generally the premium comes on pure lots. And this is especially important to the Chinese, as I mentioned, because of their high adjunct brewing, and maybe they want to have like a new variety like Fraser for that, and then for some other beers they'll use Copeland, which is a lower enzyme beer. Mitchell will talk a little bit about practices to keep your varietal purity and
Doug. Yeah, and as I'm sure you've noticed throughout the presentation, the focus on the management practices we're looking at is the ones that could be implemented from where we are now. So obviously, variety purity starts much earlier than where we are today, but from where we are at this point, as harvest is progressing. If you're managing more than one variety on the farm, making sure that truck augers, combine, grain bins are all clean, either when you start or in between varieties that are harvested. So they have to be kept very clean, and that minimizes any carryover between them, which it seems like it's a small amount, but if you are using farm safe seed, it'll that could carry on into the future and lead to problems. So it is important. And so the other thing, it seems like it's pretty obvious, but making sure that you know what variety goes into what bin, and you have good records of that. I've seen instances in the last few years where that there has been a mix-up on farm and just in what variety it was, and so it goes and gets tested and comes back and it's not the thing, and that was put forward because the more commonly used test, it only tests for the presence of what you've asked it to test for, and so it's not a discovery test. It's a test to be able to verify what has been asked. And so if you're saying it's you've got it as Fraser, and you say it's Fraser, it goes and it gets tested and happens to be Connect, it would come back as 0% Fraser. So it does occasionally happen. So it is important to make sure that is well looked after. And if you ever do have any questions, there are other tests that can be used that can be a discovery type test. So the Grain Commission is the more expensive way to do it, but it's the gold standard for varietal purity, and it can tell you exactly what it is that you've got. The other one is that CNBDC has been experimenting with Zumagra, and has a unit at their location where they are using visual recognition and artificial intelligence to verify varietal purity, and it has been pretty successful. So that's a good option. If there's any questions about where something has gone, that could be looked at. And I guess if you're looking at delivering and you had the varietal purity test done, and there's any questions about what has happened, and it doesn't make sense to you how this could be, those options at CMPDC and the Canadian Grain Commission would be ones to pursue for any questions about varietal purity.
Okay, just quickly, so we did mention Fusarium head blight and Dawn. So the general spec in the industry is 0.5 parts per million. So, and I did mention that usually this will increase on the malt. And then we have very tight ergot. We will not select it if we see ergot in your selection sample. At the gate, we do have a quite tight spec of 0.02, and that's generally off of that's a food safety recommendation. Some of our byproducts do go into the feed market, at which there is a tighter tolerance on some of this for feeding certain animals. So we kind of hold that tight because it hurts us on both ends of our revenue streams, the malt and the byproducts. And so we'll let Andrew talk about disease management.
Yeah, so for disease management for ergot and FHB at this stage in the game, it's you have to scout to see go to like 7 to 10 spots and investigate the extent of the disease incidence in these spots. So for seeing if there's some hotspots. So for example, for ergot, like on the field boundaries, headlands, you'll probably see higher incidence rates of ergots there than in the middle of your field, and these are good to know as you move forward with combining and harvest. For FHB, you're looking for fusarium damaged kernels, although it should be known that fusarium damaged kernels are a little harder to identify in barley. In wheat, they're like the very chalky white color. In barley, they're more just like darker stained. So they're harder to identify, and they might still have that orange sporulation though on the outside that can help with that. But if you find fusarium damaged kernels, that doesn't always correlate perfectly to there being dawn in those kernels. So when it's good to know, or sort of dawn being in any other kernels, because dawn accumulation can happen in kernels that don't show fusarium damaged kernel symptoms. So just understanding where the disease incidence is important. With barley, and it's a little tougher to blow those out the back because they stay a little plumper. So in wheat, you usually increase the fan speed to blow those light kernels out the back, and you can slow the combine too to increase that separation. But barley, it's a little more difficult to do this. So a few things to think about is harvesting these areas that have high disease incidence separately from the rest of the crop. So separate them so that you have some stuff that is better malt quality compared to something that has more disease. And then you can think about seed cleaning as well. It's quite expensive, but it can be done, especially for ergot. It can be cleaned quite easily.
So residues are obviously a problem on the malt end because their buyers are checking for the limits that they have as they're going into whatever country that they do, whether it's domestic or an export, and they need to observe those maximum residue limits. And so basically, I think that comes down to using chemistries according to their labels, but making sure that that's within your contract too. And so pre-harvest glyphosate is a big no-no. Same with heat or sulfophenicil. There's actually no desiccants registered for any cereal grains. The closest you get is pre-harvest weed control with glyphosate and heat. And so there's zero tolerance for that in the malt world, and so that, I guess, it makes those decisions fairly straightforward. If you've got to manage for staginess, any of the different management methods we've talked about throughout the presentation will be helpful, and that's just part of growing malt barley. The other one to consider is pre-harvest intervals. Now, this is not likely to be an issue with herbicides and most fungicides that I can think of. Insecticides is the real one to watch closely, and I'm not saying to ignore the others, but insecticides, if you're applying anything relatively late in the growing season to manage any insect pests, make sure you're aware of what that pre-harvest interval is. So if you're looking in the Guide to Crop Protection or the Blue Book in Alberta, they will have that listed as what the pre-harvest interval is. If you've got any questions about that, search up what the actual label is from the company, because that's the official official guide. And so some of those pre-harvest intervals can be up in the range of 30, maybe even 45 days. So there is quite a need to make sure there's well separated from harvest, and so that would relate to time to combine if you're straight cutting, or time to swath if you have swath. So there's a difference there if you're swathing. Keep It Clean does have a good resource for what you can and cannot use in production of your crop, and so that's the best place to check for which chemistries to avoid.